Hello and welcome back to COP26 We Got This, the podcast series that has been preparing you for the 2021 United Nations Climate Change Conference, also known as COP26.
COP26, we got this. The podcast discussing the issues, ideas, and debates behind the summit that will shape the future of our planet. Brought to you by the Australian National University and King's College London.
My name is Dr. Megan Bowman, and I'm an Associate Professor in Law and Director of the Climate Law and Governance Centre at King's College London.
And my name is Dr. Will Grant. I'm from the Australian National Centre for the Public Awareness of Science at ANU.
So COP26 officially wrapped up less than 2 weeks ago, and we're all left mulling over the outcomes and emotions of such a critical milestone event for global action on climate change. And there's been a range of responses from different quarters. Many of these responses have been very vocal, and they seem to fall into three large groupings. One response has labelled COP26 a failure. This grouping comprises a number of voices ranging from youth activists to writers in the Financial Times and even some environmental law academics. Their main reasons are that COP26 failed to put us on a trajectory to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees or to take care of the most vulnerable countries who face the brunt of loss and damage to their lives and lands. A second grouping of response, like that given by Christiana Figueres, acknowledge the disappointments but say that COP26 definitely sped up the pace of action. It did this by setting a yearly ratchet of country commitments instead of the 5 yearly cycles specified in the Paris Agreement, which is the best way to ensure that we are halving emissions by 2030 and so keeping 1.5 degrees in sight. And also by finally recognising the critical role of nature and forests, which is a first for a climate COP. And a third grouping of response focuses on the successful first-time milestones, particularly the pledges on methane, deforestation, EV and private finance, particularly if they become subject to meaningful oversight and ratcheting. Indeed, some specialists have commented that the implementation of those efforts will have more impact than the vague coal-related language in the Glasgow Pact.
But something that everyone seems to agree on is that the clock continues to tick, and it's time now to turn the talk into action. So this week, for our final episode to wrap up our series, we aim to look beyond the headlines and the polemics to focus on the real challenges and potentials moving forward. Some of the key questions we're hoping to answer through chatting to our guests are: what happened at COP26? What are the implications? And where to from here for global climate action that can meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement and protect future generations and the most vulnerable, all within the tight timeframe given by the IPCC?
So today we have 4 incredible experts joining us to help navigate these really big questions. We have Dr. Helen Adams, who is a senior lecturer in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation at King's College London. Her research looks at the subjective dimensions of human interactions with environmental change, with a focus on marginal regions of low-income countries. She's currently the head of science engagement for the UK COP presidency, and she's also lead author for Working Group 2 of the 6th Assessment Report of the IPCC.
We also have Dr. Stephen Minas, who is a Senior Research Fellow at the Transnational Law Institute of King's College London, an Associate Professor at the Peking University School of Transnational Law. He's also Chair of the Technology Executive Committee of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, a member of the Advisory Board of the Climate Technology Centre and Network, and a participant in UN climate negotiations. Formerly, he was an advisor in the Office of the Premier of Victoria in Australia.
We also have Dr. Virginia Marshall, the star of one of our earlier episodes. She's back with us today. She's the inaugural Indigenous Postdoctoral Fellow with the Australian National University School of Regulation and Global Governance and the Fenner School of Environment and Society. She's a practicing lawyer and duty solicitor, a former associate and researcher with the Federal Court of Australia in Sydney, and a professional member of the New South Wales Law Society and Women Lawyers Association of New South Wales. Virginia is also the winner of the W.H. Stanner Award for the Best Thesis by an Indigenous author and a principal investigator with an Australian Research Council Indigenous Discovery Grant.
And finally, Dr. Christian Downie. Christian is an associate professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance at the Australian National University. He holds an Australian Research Council DECRA Fellowship and was previously a Vice-Chancellor's Postdoctoral Fellow at the University of New South Wales. Christian has worked as an advisor to several Australian government agencies, including the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet.
Welcome, everyone, first of all. Welcome. Let us begin with Helen and Stephen. So you were both at the COP in official capacities. Helen is part of the UK presidency, COP presidency, and Stephen is part of the EU delegation and also chair for the Technology Committee. Can you tell us more about the jobs that you had to do there and how it all looked and felt to you from the inside? Stephen, do you want to start?
Absolutely. Well, the COP is really a place for multitasking. So those of us who are on a party delegation have responsibilities in the negotiations themselves. And that's at this COP, that was quite a heavy responsibility because there was a 2-year backlog of work. So there were many more negotiating tracks than we're used to. But at the same time, those of us who have responsibilities in the various bodies of the UN climate system, such as the Technology Executive Committee, also have to present the work of the various bodies at various side events, have to participate in meetings with other bodies. And at this COP, importantly, had to look at the beginnings of the global stocktake under which the various bodies, such as the Technology Executive Committee, are required to produce reports. So there was a lot of work to do. It was very interesting work, but of course, it's a very concentrated period, 2 weeks, and in this case, 2 weeks for which we had prepared for almost 2 years. And it was certainly a set of outcomes that we can discuss, but it's certainly a concentrated period which doesn't afford a great deal of time to think whilst you're there.
So, Stephen, at the time, there's a lot going on. And I know, having attended this COP as well myself, there is so much going on. And particularly for people like you who were working in official capacities, I can only imagine it was incredibly taxing. In terms of what came out of the COP, the outcomes, what are your reflections from your perspective of having been there and working so hard in the lead up to it?
I think this was a very important COP for a number of reasons. First of all, after this unprecedented hiatus, in the midst of a pandemic, it demonstrated that it is possible to do real in-person diplomacy in what seems to have been a relatively safe way, responsible way, and to get genuine outcomes. So I think that that's a transferable lesson across other processes as well. And I think particularly as the pandemic seems to be endemic, it's an important lesson for the international community. More specifically, this COP delivered the final outcomes necessary to complete the Paris rulebook. And this is of great importance because, of course, the Paris Agreement, agreed in 2015, entered force in 2016, but entered force without all of the detailed implementing decisions. Most of these only came in 2018 in Katowice in Poland, but some very important components were left undone. These are the market mechanisms and the non-market approaches under Article 6, the finalization of the transparency framework, and the common timeframes for nationally determined contributions. NDCs, of course, being central to the ambition and the ratchet mechanism of the Paris Agreement. So the fact that this COP, and inevitably in its final days, final hours really, was able to complete the Paris rulebook, I think should give us confidence about the further implementation, the credible implementation with transparency, with a degree of commonality, and of course with those market mechanisms, which should be on the basis of these decisions an improvement on what was under the Kyoto Protocol. So if we look just at the negotiations themselves, and there was a lot of other important things happening outside the negotiations, then these outcomes to complete the Paris rulebook, I think, were very important.
Helen, could we just grab some reflections from you? What was the experience like for you in this whirlwind of multitasking and meetings going on everywhere, face to face?
Thanks. I mean, it is a phenomenal trade show. It's a climate change show, and it's there's the greater the good of climate from around the world. But I was there as the COP presidency, so our role was in the negotiations more neutral, and I wasn't involved in the negotiations, so I won't speak to that. But our role, what we tried to do as presidency, was to use the year, which ended up being 2 years because of COVID, to really change the pace of action, or to change the landscape around the COP that allowed people and countries to make higher and more ambitious nationally determined contributions. So for us, it was those things that Megan mentioned, the COP, the phasing out of coal, the moving to electric vehicles, getting rid of the internal combustion engine, stopping deforestation, improving supply chains. And so for us, it was a great COP because we saw those commitments come from countries. And in the first week, we saw these commitments made. And as Megan said, we got some criticism because are they just all fancy commitments that are empty and no one's gonna do anything? But at the same time, what those commitments allowed countries to do was to see that everything's moving in one direction and one direction only. That net zero will happen, that nature will be protected, and gave them the confidence to put in those higher NDCs.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Helen. And I think that's important when looking at the outcomes, in an honest way, where there are disappointments and where is the hope? And I think for you as a scholar, because you wear pretty much everyone on this panel wears a number of different hats, and you're a scholar as well as having been involved in this, the UK COP presidency. As a scholar who focuses on low-income countries, for you, how do you see some of the ways forward now? Where are the hot spots that really need attention?
Yeah, obviously there was tensions. There's what you would love as a scholar to happen versus the way you can meet people and the changes that you can make when you're in government. And we could have a whole podcast about that, maybe when I'm out of the job. But I think for me, obviously finance is the key thing, and that's the key thing for everybody, that there needs to be this flow of climate finance to help the countries that we all know it that didn't do the pollution, adapt and mitigate. And then for me, my role was head of science engagement. So for me, I see how do we help countries. Countries now have committed to net zero targets that none of us have any idea how to reach, not just the low income countries. No one really knows how to get there, right? And so for me, you talk about hope, but I see the role of academia now, and how can we start to support our countries in planning for net zero and achieving net zero and even zero, if not net zero as well. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on okay, let's roll up our sleeves now and how do we actually achieve this?
Helen, it's so great that you mentioned your science engagement role. I'd love to hear a little bit more on that because Adam Tooze, British historian, says that there's still a massive gap between the scientific recognition of a climate emergency and societal ability to agree on radical action. Thinking in terms of science engagement, are there ways that this gap could be bridged?
It's a question of the ages, isn't it? And although my job was to engage academics on COP, my job very quickly became, those broader questions of why. Why is it that the academics are screaming from the rooftops, but we can't translate that into action? And I think we've tried to find concrete ways of bringing the two together. So in my job, we tried very diligently to bring in the social sciences and to bring in Indigenous knowledge and to bring in different forms of knowledge that showed different pathways forward. We really tried to promote the fact that the best climate solutions are going to come from an all-of-society approach with diversity of views, diversity of knowledges. And we're working towards actually this question of why can't we translate the risk? We have a work program that was announced on Science Innovation Day at COP that will continue forward, which is a coalition of organizations to actually sit down and think through how can we deliver information on the risks that climate change poses in a way that's consistent with how heads of government think. And that's something that we're going to sit down and talk through. But I think how you get a broad diversity of academics engaging constructively with governments who are thirsty for knowledge and thirsty for action is a question that I think has broader implications towards funding, motivations within academia, all those things we know that encourage academics to engage with policy.
Thanks, Helen. I think that's really important. From my perspective, this COP, it was a real trigger for self-reflection about our role, because a lot of our work as academics is the thinking and it is the talking. And then we kind of pump the ball to someone else to do the action. But for me, I found myself doing a lot of self-reflection around the impact of the work that we do and how that can become a very conscious thing. I think that it's percolating, and I feel that Stephen sort of hinted at that in that 2 weeks at the COP, there's a lot going on. You don't have a lot of time to think. And now we're in the period of reflection before we hope the period of action. So, and I think we all feel that. It's not just the people that had hands on deck during the COP, but it's any of us who were there, I think, and all of us who are touched by this, which is everyone. So, yeah, it's going to percolate for a while, I think. Yeah. And Stephen, do you feel that too? I mean, obviously, Helen mentioned finance. We have the role of tech and the importance of finance for technology. Where are the challenges in that? Talk us through that, because it's such an important area, but I'm not sure it always gets the spotlight it deserves. Talk us through some of the sticking points there and the things that you are hopeful about.
Sure. Well, there is no shortage of challenges, but I also suggest there is no shortage of reasons for hope. I think what we saw at this COP, it's absolutely correct. Finance was a major challenge because it's not just words. We came to this COP with a pretty clear picture on the collective failure to mobilize $100 billion US dollars per annum by 2020 by developed parties, for developing parties. And it's not just a number. This figure was crucial to the landing ground that became the Paris Agreement, to the broader compromise that became Paris. It has an older history from Copenhagen, but nevertheless. So this was a finance COP. There were many positives. Most of the positives were outside of the negotiating room about the various announcements and initiatives to help achieve Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement to make finance flows consistent with climate mitigation and adaptation. So there's a lot happening in the real world. In the negotiations, it is very difficult. It's partly difficult because of the situation on the 100 billion goal. And I have to point out that not every developed party contributed equally to that outcome. If we look at 2019, which is the last year for which full figures are available, we see that the European Union and its member states contributed public finance of $25 billion. And if you add the additional finance mobilized by the EU, it comes to about a third of the overall target. So clearly not everybody had the same contribution, but it is a challenge. And now we have this additional challenge of identifying a post-2025 quantified collective finance goal in the shadow of what happened on $100 billion. Progress was made, a work program was set up, but this is a very sensitive area. It's particularly a sensitive area, of course, for developing countries. Then, of course, there's this sense that climate finance is not balanced as between mitigation and adaptation finance. So there was a big focus in Glasgow on adaptation finance and a new call for developed parties to double their adaptation finance. So that sort of high level work is happening. It's very political. On the ground, guidance is being given to bodies like the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, the Global Environment Facility. These bodies are now all up and running. The years of the GCF's early development are behind us. So these bodies are functioning, but clearly there is a lot more demand for finance, and it clearly cannot all be public finance, and it clearly cannot all be finance from developed parties.
It's fascinating to hear these stories of hope. It's great to, when we think of the ways that Megan framed responses to COP26 at the beginning of this episode, that there are those talking stories of gloom, those of COP being a failure, but it's really important, I think, to hear these underlying stories of hope and success. Stephen, you were there as a negotiator, but obviously you are also a researcher. What do you take back from this in terms of your own research agenda in the year to come? What do you think, okay, this is the next question that I need to be answering?
Certainly. Well, there are two things. One of them is about how this process works. We talk about international environmental law, climate law, and at the head of it is this very politicized process, which is basically producing a great deal of soft law, the occasional treaty, of course, but essentially law that is not binding as between states in the way that we traditionally think of it. So I've written a bit in the past about this process and its relationship with the real world in the area of climate technology governance. And I'm reflecting more now on the role of bodies like the tech, bodies where individuals are there ostensibly in their personal capacity and how they relate to the broader decision-making process. So that's one thing. And the other thing is this broader challenge of the greening of finance under Article 21C of the Paris Agreement. And this is less about the UN process, and it's more about how that process is taken up in the capital markets, by multilateral development banks, etc. So I've done some writing on that, and I intend to do more.
Thank you very much. We love Article 21C. It's a huge focus for me to the finance objective of the Paris Agreement. Yes. Helen, let's wrap up this section by asking, what are the next steps? What happens now? And you can wear whichever hat you want to, whether it's both. Wear both hats. Once you start off with the UK presidency hat and then move to the scholar hat.
Thanks. From the UK presidency perspective, we're really keen to show that the commitments made aren't empty, right? That action will be taken to, on sustainable supply chains, on stopping deforestation, on phasing out electric vehicles. And that will be our focus for the year that we are presidents now. Also working with Egypt and Sharm el-Sheikh as the next COP. And for me personally, ensuring that science, evidence-based policy making has a high profile continually throughout. Always has. I mean, the IPCC's started the UNFCCC, right? So there's always been that link between evidence and the climate negotiations. But how can we keep bringing that science knowledge on the risks to be avoided, but on also the solutions that are available, the technology, the social solutions that are all available? So I think that's us for the next year is making sure that there's tangible action towards those commitments that were made. On a personal level, who knows? I think at the moment I'm focusing on this stuff about risk. So how would you, if you could take the great and the good of the World Science Organization, so the World Meteorological Organization, the International Science Council has signed up, how do we start to work towards improving the way that we do science on climate change so that it better meets the people we want to influence? And I think that's my focus in the coming months is to set up some working groups on that, because it's a big question. I mean, I'm not solving that question, right? But, in this one thing of how do we deliver climate risk information to heads of government, there's a bigger question of why, and you raised it to me, and why we as academics are so reluctant to deliver our information in a way that meets the needs of the people we're trying to influence. And then we get frustrated as to why it doesn't influence them, but because we don't speak their language. And I think that's something that I'm going to be thinking about to segue into the personal and the academic. That's something I'm going to be thinking about for a long time.
It's a big question, Helen, but it's a good question. It's a really important thing for all of us in the research space from whatever discipline, to think more about how we can make sure that the work we do goes out and connects with the people that we need to connect with. I think now let's turn to another perspective from someone who was at COP. Virginia, you were also at COP26 in an official capacity with the UN. Could you explain to us a little more about your role there, and then maybe give us a little bit of your personal experience of how it all went down?
Well, I was very fortunate to be endorsed and also nominated by the Indigenous Peoples Organisation of Australia, and then was selected as one of two, myself and another representative from the Pacific area, as a Pacific delegate to the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform and the meetings that were held at COP26, and also provided a number of presentations to the UNFCCC in relation to Indigenous food systems and medicines, and also the Earth Observation Day. So it was a very important purpose and mission, which was to represent the people of the Pacifics. And as everybody knows, in relation to the impact of climate change. The Pacific peoples have really been carrying a huge burden, where most of the apathy towards Pacific Islander peoples, and especially Australia, where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples live in a global south, in a very, very wealthy country because of Aboriginal resources being extracted in Australia, which is a global north. So it was a huge responsibility, and also a very unique opportunity to really network with so many Indigenous peoples around the world, and to find that collective voice, and also really relate our issues from our respective homelands.
And I think, Virginia, I want to delve a little more into your experience of the Climate Summit, and particularly that last thing that you mentioned about sharing the stories from homelands. It seems that storytelling, more and more, am I connecting with the idea that storytelling is a really important, that it's not what we think it is. It's actually a really important way of communicating with each other to help grasp the enormity of these kind of issues in a way that just being intellectual and logical about them doesn't cut it. And I never really thought about it much as relevant to my own work, but at this COP, every time I gave a presentation, about climate finance law, I found myself engaging in storytelling. And it really seemed to open up a much more heart-centered experience for us all, which seemed to really change the level of conversation and understanding in the room. Would you agree? Is there a role for storytelling us in moving us forward that we just haven't really given proper credit to yet?
Well, I think that the basis of all of this is really Indigenous science. I mean, we talk about Western science, but that isn't as old as Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge. And especially because Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are the oldest living surviving culture in the whole world. So there is so much that we can learn from our peoples, and many other communities can learn from us. For example, we have creation stories and the understandings of where our medicines come from, and the importance of climate change indicators for the environment. So, we don't see ourselves as separate to, but we're also an important part and role as human beings, as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, in caring for country, and also the balance between animals and every living thing. And we see inanimate and the intangible as tangible. So there's an incredible knowledge there that we have. And I could understand in a lot of the discussions that I had with the knowledge holders that, building capacity of local communities and Indigenous peoples in this platform was so important, because we shared Indigenous knowledge, and also we understood and gave our introductions in language. So from very many different countries, from Canada or Africa, etc., we provided our introductions, and the language embeds the law. It's not fanciful, it's not folklore, but it really cemented our relationships. And over the time that we were together, it was made very clear that the world could benefit from actually engaging. And we've seen one of the big issues that we raised together was the failure for the IPCC to really engage Indigenous authorship. There were a number of issues that we were taking that really need to change. We need to be the author of our own words, and as community people and as representatives, we need to have that voice, and that's something that the IPCC reports have failed ongoingly to engage with. So there are a lot of benefits for those areas, like you were mentioning with the Paris Agreement. We have a lot of engagement in discussing that. And of course, our co-chair, Andrea Craven, had really said that, we've been waiting since the 1980s for something to change. And we're seeing incremental changes where the rising sea levels, for example, in the Pacific and especially in the Torres Strait Islands, is really dangerous and is going to make people stateless refugees. So, and one of the issues again was climate change finance, and that's been mentioned today. That, when people are losing their cultural home and their safety and their burial sites are being washed in the sea, their crops are being overwhelmed with salty water and the crops fail, that's an incredible burden to actually live with. And one of those burdens was COVID that we talked about as well. The impact of COVID every day is exhausting people, and of course being marginalised and also disadvantaged because the wealth seems to be in such a small area across the globe, and being held by a small percentage of people. That that distribution of climate finance, it's much easier to actually take a loan out for a greater amount of money than small pockets of money. So people who only just need a small amount of climate finance for that adaptation or mitigation areas that we discussed today are being left out because their application is for far less than what the climate finance wishes to deal with. So you can see that there's a number of issues that really need to be addressed. And again, we need to have greater critical mass of Indigenous peoples really being at the forefront of these groups, and the COP presidency needs to also have a greater critical mass of representatives at the forefront. I think that's really important.
It's, so useful and important for us to hear all of these different perspectives and the ways that we really need to grapple with so many things that you've said there, Virginia. I was thinking when you're talking about the number of Indigenous peoples from around the world gathered together at COP and introducing in language, sadly we can't hear all of their stories, but is there one particular moment within that where you could hear others' stories from around the world that really resonated with you? One story of what struck you as something that really needs to be taken forward to the world?
Well, I think the most important thing, as I said, which resonated with myself and all of the Indigenous peoples and local communities, was that we feel that we are actually being left out of the decision making. We're being left out of these critical discussions on the Paris Agreement and also even to the top of the COP presidency. So I think that the exclusion from the Paris Agreement was very telling in the conversations, but also the engagement of hope was really through our Indigenous knowledge and our collective knowledge worldwide. I think that is really an important issue to grasp hold of, because that recognition that we understand as ourselves being self-determining sovereign people really creates, through our tens of thousands of years, our thousands of years of really working with the environment, understanding and caring for country, that we can relate that knowledge to situations that are occurring today. But again, we need engagement, and that was a collective message. We have to be engaged. And from Latin America, for example, they can see that those solutions from their perspective is nature-based solutions, and there's always a combination of understanding that Aboriginal medicines are hugely effective, and also the need for Aboriginal medicines is going to become more clear. But as we turn our backs on mitigation and adaptation, and also really coming to grips with climate change as a world message, as you mentioned earlier, those Aboriginal medicines and those foods are going to become much more important, because we can see that GMO, for example, has a very negative effect, not only financially, but on others that don't wish to grow GMO. So, those issues of biodiversity and customary engagement and customary law and looking at security from years hence really does and will rely on combining Indigenous knowledge and the collective understanding and wisdom from our peoples.
Thank you, Virginia. It's a really powerful message, and it's something that goes well beyond COP26. And indeed, we can use the climate context discussion as a platform for that. But you're talking, I think, about something even more further reaching than that, which is really how we engage with the First Nations people on this planet. Is that essentially what you would say?
Yeah, I think that's really the crux of it. And I think it's important because we know that there's many issues that we're still dealing with, the removal of Indigenous children, the murdering of Indigenous women across the planet, and the destruction of homeland, the theft of territorial areas and water, for example, and also the commodification of water was something that we agreed that was also impacting not only on Indigenous peoples but worldwide because of these extreme weather events from climate change, where we have droughts and very unusual weather that is making even growing crops. Was one of the issues that we discussed, that is also becoming hard. So that food sovereignty is one issue, but food production with climate change being a daily problem is something that is really such a hard issue to deal with when, again, as I mentioned, Indigenous peoples and local communities have had all of the answers on how to have a sustainable life. So, this climate change is really impacting, and that's why we know we have to work together with every group across this planet to really make sure that we survive, and that depends on nation states carrying that heavy load. So, there lies the problem. COP was essentially a trade show. Well, it showed that nuclear energy is clean energy, and we know the evidence does not say that, and we've got enough Australian reports to really speak to those issues. And we know that we have to really engage on the global stage, and Australia just didn't lift their weight. So that was disappointing. But, I think it's just, as I said before I left COP, that, we all have to, as countries, as nation states, contribute not only to repaying the debt, which Stephen had mentioned, that also hasn't been paid. And climate financing just seems to be a revolving door where we don't seem to be getting much action on. So I think that, we can have a positive outcome, but it's going to really take, as you said, really having the public understand the message and the critical nature. And we had this problem with COVID. And we really need to engage in this for our own survival.
You've pointed a lot there about ways forward, Virginia. I just love to get a final take. I mean, would you look at COP26 in Glasgow as being a success for Indigenous voices? Or would you say that there is so much more that we need to do that this was just a drop in the ocean?
Well, I think the most important thing is the hunger for extractive industries and commodification. Those are the biggest decisions that we make as a worldwide community. And I don't think it's as binary as a success or failure. I think it's like our own lives. We can see that there are certain things that we do that make an impact, certain things that we don't reach or attain what we expected to attain. And I think that's something that we can see in this COP. But what we need to do is be very prepared and also be prepared to change our collective thinking on engaging Indigenous peoples and local communities and making sure that, we are front and centre. And Indigenous academics and scholars and community people should not be undermined. They should be part of that shared understanding, and also, solving these issues is not going to happen without everyone being engaged. So I think that that's really important to have that message, Will, that, for the survival of the human race, we do need to stop politicising climate change and, again, understanding that the evidence also includes Indigenous science. That's critical.
Thank you so much, Virginia. Really clear, very powerful sentiments and messages. On that note, Christian, let's have a chat with you, because some of the things that's come out of the discussion so far, both Helen and Virginia have mentioned, we need everyone to take part, to take action. And more, I think, we're feeling that each of us, and yet nation states have such a pivotal role in this whole process. It's quite clear that we need transformational, not incremental progress. But of course, the way the international diplomacy works is incremental. It is indeed incremental. So I guess the problem with climate diplomacy, as opposed to other issue areas, is that it's trying to address an existential threat. And let me quote former Maldives President Mohammed Nasheed, who said in 2019, "I can't see why we are waiting for every single person to agree that we should not die." So, Christian, what are your reflections on the COP26 process? And looking forward, what do you think is the future for international diplomacy in this space?
Well, thank you, Megan and Will, and thanks for having me on. Such a cheerful quote to start me off with, Megan. Appreciate that. Death, is that where you want me to go? Look, I think there was some good news out of the Glasgow Climate Pact. I think we've got to remember that we reached an agreement. Not all climate negotiations reach an agreement. We saw that back in The Hague in the late 1990s. We saw the problems in Copenhagen. So we've got an agreement. And I think from my point of view, the other really good point to come out of Glasgow is that for the first time, these negotiations are starting to focus on the main game, which is phasing out fossil fuels. You have to remember that climate change, acting on climate change, is essentially about leaving fossil fuels in the ground. It's essentially about transitioning away from the production and consumption of oil, gas, and coal. And this was the first time that these negotiations started actually mentioning those commodities. Now, of course, we know that some of the language on coal, phasing that out, was watered down. But the fact that these negotiations are starting to focus on fossil fuels, I think, is a big step forward. And the other really bright spot for me was that countries agreed to come back next year to try and ensure that all countries have better targets for 2030. And this is crucial because, as that last quote indicated, without improved pledges to reduce emissions, we are going to be on course for a climate catastrophe. And we know from some of the immediate assessments that have been done in the aftermath of the negotiations last week, that even if all the countries do what they're going to say they've done and honour their pledges, the world is still on track for global warming of around about 2.5 to 2.7 degrees by the end of the century. And this would be devastating for many of the communities that Virginia has mentioned, for many of people in Australia, and of course, an existential threat for our neighbours in the Pacific. So the fact that the negotiations, have said that we're going to come back next year, that we're starting to target fossil fuels, which is the main problem here, gives, I think, all of us hope that we're getting on the right path finally.
Christian, that's a fascinating point because I can imagine that there might be activists out there who think it's taken 26 years for COPs to start talking about the main game and to get a fairly watered down version of the main game where we're finally talking about fossil fuels, but only just. Suggests this process is so incrementally slow that the Greta Thunbergs of the world might say, this is just talk. Are COPs essential to solving climate change? Are they the way forward, or are they just a talk shop and we need to be doing other things as well or more?
Well, I think you're exactly right. We need to be talking. We need to be negotiating. Negotiations are much better than coercion or wars or other forms of, international relationships between states. So negotiations are vital. But as you say, Will, they're not enough. And the key challenge now is that this is a race to decarbonise our societies as quickly as possible if we're going to avert the worst impacts that, the Greta Thunbergs and all the student climate movement that we're seeing mobilise realise is going to happen in our lifetime and more seriously in theirs as well. And so, look, if we had till the end of this century to stabilise emissions, I'd be feeling pretty comfortable right now. But the problem is that we don't. And global emissions really should have peaked by now. That's what climate scientists have been telling us. We already heard, about last decade was the critical decade. Now this decade is the critical decade. So we need to get moving. And I think this has a series of implications which makes climate change quite different to other global problems. Because of the urgency and the scale of the problem, we really need states to act. This can't be left to business. This can't be left to markets alone. They're just not fast enough. They won't get us there in time. And I wanted to give you, one quick example. You think about electric vehicles, right? General Motors started working on these about 20 years ago, Tesla more than 10 years ago, and total electric vehicle sales in the US still make up only 2% of total car sales. Here in Australia, where I'm based, it's less than 1% of total car sales are electric vehicles. Now, if you're in a race to decarbonise the transport sector, you can rely on carbon pricing, which might have worked a few decades ago, but the quickest way to get it done now is for governments to set the rule of the game, to put in place mandates like we're seeing in parts of Europe, and to back it up with the billions of investments that Helen and Stephen have mentioned are vitally important.
Thanks, Christian. So on that note, then, I mean, the big message coming out of this COP26 is turning the talk into action. So I guess what you've just mentioned there is one way to do that. What do you see as the next steps forward from here?
Well, what will be crucial is what countries come back to the negotiations next year. And of course, there's finance, which we've already covered to some extent. One thing that struck me was some of the side agreements that I think Stephen mentioned as well. There was some around phasing out coal. There was ones around methane. But I think what's quite interesting and will be crucial to determining what happens over the next few years, which we haven't mentioned, was that announcement between the US and China that they're willing to cooperate on climate change. And that was in the margins of the negotiations, I think, in the first week. Now, officially, the US and China are strategic competitors. I think in the first week of the negotiations, their negotiators and even their leaders were trading insults. So the fact that the two largest emitters in the world, representing 40% of global greenhouse gas emissions, said, look, we're going to put aside that rivalry for a moment. We're going to put aside that competition right now and think about ways that we can cooperate on climate change, ways that we might be able to, have an oasis of cooperation in this policy domain while continuing to strategically compete in finance, in technology, on vaccines, whatever it happens to be, I think is really important, because without these two superpowers on board, there's no way that we're going to meet the types of greenhouse gas reduction targets that scientists are telling us are necessary. So the fact that these two countries are coming together, that they're talking about action, not in 2050, but over the next 5 to 10 years, I think is important. And I think it shows that if these two countries can, and this is the big if, right? Can these two countries, have an oasis of cooperation in climate change while continuing to compete in other policy domains? I think it's a question that a lot of commentators are focused on, because there are obvious concerns that competition in some areas will spill over into climate change, and that would, really undermine global efforts. But if they can cooperate, then I think, it's a really good indicator that these two powers might help to lead the world into something slightly more progressive.
Great stuff, Christian. It makes me hopeful. Look, I want to say, first of all, thanks so much to all of you for contributing your insights, Virginia, Christian, Stephen, Helen. But before you go, I'd love to know. So Megan has mentioned it, that this COP has been about turning talk into action. And of course, Christian, as you've just said, action at the big interstate level is absolutely critical. But we know that there's action at lower levels all the way down through the system, down to us as individuals and what we can do as organisations and what we can do in our own countries. I'd love to ask all of you, just as a final wrap-up, what are the actions that we should take next to make sure that we peak global climate and bring it back down again? Stephen.
Well, in one word, vote. I think we have to recognize that governments are central here, and the quickest way to change the policies, if the policies need changing, is to change the government. Now, sadly, that's not possible in every country, but where it is, I think engaged voting, active citizenship on climate change is crucial. There's a lot more that individuals can do, but ultimately this is a systemic problem, not an individual problem, and it requires systemic solutions, including from government.
That's awesome, Stephen. Helen?
I think I would go back to Virginia's point and the point I made about collaboration. I think unless we have a vision of the future that includes multiple perspectives and acknowledges that certain people aren't really doing well in the current future, in the current present we have, we're not going to get effective solutions for the future. So I think it's about the idea of, we organised an event at COP on Indigenous self-determination and research. So the Inuit have ITK, an organisation in Canada, has a strategy for research and for climate change that prioritises self-determination, and the UK government's funding some research around that, or funding some research proposals around that. And we need more of that. We need more of
coming together and different perspectives and bringing people on the margins to the table. And that's how we're going to get solutions that will take us together into the future that we all want and need.
Wow. Christian?
Look, for me, it's dealing with the energy sector. The energy sector still provides 2/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. 80% of global energy demand is met by fossil fuels. This hasn't changed in 40 years. So the best thing we need to do right now is as Stephen says, vote for governments that are going to decarbonise the energy sector, get us away from the dirty fossil fuels that we've been using in the past, and move to the huge renewable opportunities that countries like Australia and many others can benefit from. A cleaner energy future that will not only reduce the worst risks of climate change, improve our health with cleaner air, but also save the existential problems that so many countries might face in the coming decades if we don't act.
That's great. Virginia?
I think I'll take one example out of the People's Plenary, which was really powerful. And one of the speakers asked us to stand up if we'd lost loved ones to COVID. And most of the room stood up. And then we were asked again by the speaker to stand up if the community that we live in had experienced climate impact. And then the whole room stood up. And that really said it all. Everyone has been touched in some way by climate change. And that was very, very, very amazing in the way those simple words created an awareness in the whole room that each one of us are connected and we each are invested in this change. That was powerful.
Incredibly powerful stuff. Thank you so much, everyone. We're going to wrap up here. I really want to focus on one of the comments that Virginia made in wrapping up, which is that each one of us is connected and invested in this change. And as Stephen said, it's systemic change, but also, as Helen highlighted, it's individual change. And as Christian mentioned, it's at the nation state level and in sectors and industries such as energy. But that notion, each one of us is connected and invested in this change, I think, is the take-home message from this episode and from this series. So I want to thank all of our guests today for helping us wrap up this series, for their incredibly important and valuable insights and the incredibly important and valuable work that they've done behind the scenes that we just saw the tip of the iceberg on today. And Will, thank you to you, my friend.
And to
it's been
you.
Fun co-piloting this crazy love boat that we put to water, and thank you, of course, to the listeners for listening. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
This was a special production by the Australian National University and King's College London. Our producers were Lamise Kazat, James Bagley, and Julia Staposka, with editing from Rachel Wall and music from Dean Smith.